The glass-walled office on the 38th floor of Horizon Airways headquarters overlooked the sprawling skyline of Dallas, Texas, but Ethan Carter barely noticed the sunrise casting golden hues over the city. His eyes were locked on his tablet, scrolling through pages of passenger complaints. His jaw tightened as he read each report, frustration creeping into his voice. For the third straight quarter, formal complaints have increased, Ethan muttered, half to himself and half to Lena Patel, his chief of operations, who sat across from his desk. And there's a troubling pattern. Lena, usually calm and collected, shifted slightly in her chair. I've noticed it too, she admitted. The majority of complaints are coming from passengers of color, especially on our southern and Midwest routes. Ethan sighed and set the tablet down, rubbing his temples. His gaze drifted toward a framed photograph on his desk. A snapshot of himself as a boy standing beside his father in front of a small Piper Cherokee aircraft. That photo was his North Star, a reminder of why he had started Horizon Airways a decade ago. After serving as one of the youngest black pilots in the Air Force, then climbing the ranks at a major airline, Ethan had launched Horizon with a vision to create an airline where every passenger and employee was treated with respect and dignity. We've implemented comprehensive sensitivity training. We've reworked our customer service protocols. We've even hired external consultants. Ethan's frustration was evident in his voice. So what the hell am I missing, Lena? Lena hesitated, choosing her next words carefully. Ethan, maybe the problem is that you're too far removed from the day-to-day passenger experience. When was the last time you flew commercial? On our airline or any other? Ethan opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. He couldn't remember. Between his private jet and packed executive schedule, it had been years since he'd experienced air travel as a regular passenger. Lena continued, We've used mystery shoppers, but there's only so much they can pick up, especially when it comes to subtle biases. She paused, debating whether to continue. What if? She trailed off, then took a deep breath. What if you went undercover? Not as Ethan Carter, the CEO of Horizon Airways, but as an ordinary black man traveling through America. Ethan turned toward the Dallas skyline, considering the idea. It was unconventional, risky, but maybe that was exactly what was needed. It would have to be thorough, he said slowly, thinking aloud. Not just one flight, a full itinerary, different routes, crew bases, enough to see the full picture. Lena nodded, already pulling up flight data on her tablet. We can focus on the routes with the most complaints. You'd need a disguise, nothing dramatic, just enough that employees who've seen you in corporate videos won't recognize you. Ethan stroked his neatly trimmed beard. I haven't shaved this since college, he mused. That's a start. Lena added, and we'll need to keep this under wraps. Just you, me, and Greg from HR. If word gets out, it defeats the purpose. Ethan's mind raced with the possibilities. Set it up, he said decisively. A full week of flights, coach class, a mix of short and long hauls including overnight trips. He paused, then added, and make sure flight 2268 to Birmingham is on the list. That route has the most complaints. Lena made a note, then looked up at Ethan, concern flickering in her eyes. Are you sure about this, Ethan? It could be uncomfortable. Ethan thought about the dream that had driven him to build Horizon Airways, the promise he had made to himself and to his father's memory. I'm sure, if something is wrong with how we're treating any of our passengers, I need to see it firsthand. No filters, no corporate spin. As Lena left to begin making arrangements, Ethan turned back toward the window, watching as a Horizon Airways jet lifted off into the morning sky, its red and silver livery gleaming in the sunlight. He wondered what truths awaited him, and whether he was prepared to face them. Ethan Carter sat alone in his penthouse apartment in downtown Dallas, the city lights flickering through the massive glass windows. A half-finished glass of bourbon rested on the table beside him, forgotten as he scrolled through an ever-growing list of customer complaints. Each message told a similar story. Passengers of color feeling ignored, overlooked, or treated differently than their white counterparts. One complaint in particular caught his eye. It was from a professor at Howard University, describing a recent Horizon Airways flight where she felt invisible. The flight attendant barely acknowledged me. She spoke around me rather than to me. Meanwhile, my white colleague was greeted warmly and given immediate attention. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had heard this before. A prominent civil rights attorney had mentioned something similar just weeks earlier. Back then, Ethan had assumed it was an isolated incident, maybe a bad day for an employee, an unfortunate misunderstanding. But now, as he scrolled through dozens of similar accounts, it was clear that this was a pattern, not an exception. His phone buzzed. A message from Lena Patel appeared on the screen. Itinerary confirmed, 7 flights, 5 cities, 4 days. Booked under the name Ethan William Clark. Ethan let out a quiet chuckle. William had been his father's name. The man who had first introduced him to aviation, who had taken him up in a rented Piper Cherokee on his 10th birthday, forever shaping his future. His father had always believed in treating people with integrity, respect, and fairness. These values had guided Ethan through military service, the corporate world, and ultimately the founding of Horizon Airways. And yet, it seemed the very company built on those principles was now failing its passengers. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow. Just as he was about to put his phone down, it buzzed again. Jordan Fields, his oldest friend and CFO, was calling. "Lena told me what you're planning." "Yeah?" Ethan replied, expecting a lecture. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan sighed. He should have known Lena would confide in Jordan. The three of them had been together since Horizon's early days, building the airline from the ground up. "I need to see it for myself, Jordan. The reports keep coming in, and nothing we're doing is making a difference." There was a pause on the line before Jordan spoke again. "You know I support you. But going undercover? It's risky. What if someone recognizes you?" Ethan shook his head, though Jordan couldn't see it. "Lena's handling the logistics. New name, shaved beard, different glasses. Besides," Ethan hesitated, feeling a familiar bitterness rise in his throat. "You'd be surprised how invisible black men can be when people aren't looking for them." Jordan was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "I get it. Just be careful, all right? This isn't just about gathering information. It's going to be emotional." Ethan knew his friend was right. They had grown up together in a predominantly black neighborhood in South Dallas, sharing the same struggles, fighting the same uphill battles. Jordan had always been the numbers guy, handling operations, finances, and logistics, while Ethan became the public face of the company, shaking hands with investors, giving keynote speeches, appearing in interviews. But that visibility came with a cost. For years, Ethan had lived in a bubble, insulated from the everyday experiences of regular black travelers. That bubble was about to burst. "I'll be fine," Ethan assured him, though even he wasn't entirely convinced. "It's just a week, and it's necessary." After ending the call, Ethan turned back to his laptop. He spent the next hour analyzing passenger reports, noting patterns in complaints. Certain routes had higher instances of discrimination. Specific crew members were named repeatedly. A few flights, like Flight 2268 to Birmingham, stood out as particularly problematic. What was happening on those flights? Why was it being ignored? How had he missed it? By midnight, he had compiled a detailed checklist, things to watch for during his journey. Tone of voice when speaking to passengers, speed of service for different demographics, eye contact and engagement levels, proactive offers of assistance, unequal enforcement of policies. Each subtle bias, each microaggression, mattered, not because they were blatant acts of racism, but because their cumulative effect created a hostile, unwelcoming atmosphere for black passengers. As he finally got up to prepare for bed, Ethan caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror. He barely recognized himself. In less than a week, he would no longer be Ethan Carter, respected CEO. He would simply be Ethan Clark, another black man navigating air travel in America. It was sobering. It was uncomfortable, and it was necessary. The following Monday morning, Ethan Carter stood in front of the hotel bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the man staring back at him. His signature beard, the one he'd worn for over a decade, was gone, leaving his face strangely bare and younger looking. Instead of his usual tailored suits and polished shoes, he wore comfortable jeans and a simple button-down shirt. His designer glasses had been replaced with plain contact lenses. A text message from Lena Patel buzzed on his phone. "Boarding pass sent. Remember, you're Ethan Clark today. Middle school history teacher from St. Louis. 1 checked bag, round-trip ticket. Good luck." Ethan took a deep breath, glancing back at his reflection. For the next 5 days, he wouldn't be Ethan Carter, the CEO of Horizon Airways, a man whose face sometimes appeared in business magazines and industry panels. He would simply be Ethan Clark, an everyday black traveler. Ethan arrived at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport and immediately felt the disorientation of traveling as an ordinary passenger. No TSA pre-check, no priority boarding lane, no nods of recognition from airline staff. He stood in his socks on the cold floor as security officers carefully inspected his carry-on bag, spending noticeably more time on his belongings than on those of the passengers before him. A small annoyance, but one that didn't go unnoticed. After clearing security, he found a seat in the crowded terminal. An elderly white woman beside him subtly clutched her purse closer and shifted slightly away. It was a feeling Ethan hadn't experienced in years, not since his days before the corporate world had wrapped him in a cocoon of privilege. He sighed, pushing the moment aside. There was no formal complaint to file, no explicit insult thrown his way. But he felt it. And that was the point of this journey. His first trip was a short flight from Dallas to Kansas City, a route typically filled with business travelers. He stood in Zone 3, watching as first-class and elite members were greeted with warm smiles and friendly chatter from the gate agents. When it was his turn, the agent barely looked at him, scanning his boarding pass with mechanical efficiency. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Clark," she said, already looking at the next passenger. Ethan filed the interaction away. A small thing, perhaps, but small things accumulated over time. Once on board, he settled into row 23, a window seat, and observed the cabin crew preparing for departure. The professionalism was there, but so were subtle differences. A bit more warmth here, a slightly cooler tone there. Nothing overt, but enough to be noticeable in his hyper-aware state. A middle-aged white man in a navy business suit gestured toward the middle seat beside Ethan. "Is this taken?" "No, go ahead," Ethan replied. The man stowed his briefcase and extended his hand. "Doug Langford, heading to a sales conference." "Ethan Clark." Doug's eyes flicked toward the book sticking out of Ethan's bag, a well-worn Civil War history book. "History teacher?" he guessed with a chuckle. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Good detective work." "You had the giveaway clue," Doug said, grinning. "My daughter would love your class. She thinks history is just memorizing dates and dead people's names." Ethan smirked. "That's what I'm trying to change." Their conversation was cut short by a flight attendant, a tall, clean-cut man with a name tag reading Ryan. But Ryan wasn't looking at Doug. He was looking directly at Ethan. "Sir, can I see your boarding pass again?" Ethan frowned, but complied, pulling up the digital pass on his phone. Ryan examined it longer than necessary, then gave a curt nod and walked away, without asking Doug for his. Doug raised an eyebrow. "That was weird. I fly this route all the time. Never been asked to reconfirm my boarding pass after I've already boarded." Ethan simply nodded, filing the interaction away. One moment didn't make a pattern, but patterns started somewhere. As the flight progressed, Ethan couldn't ignore the small discrepancies in service. When he pressed the call button for water, it took over 3 minutes for a response, despite another passenger's request being answered almost immediately. During beverage service, Ryan served the aisle and middle seat first, opposite of the usual window-to-aisle order, and nearly skipped Ethan's coffee entirely until Ethan spoke up. Doug received friendly banter from Ryan about his sales conference. With Ethan, the interactions were perfunctory at best. Small things. But the feeling in Ethan's stomach had nothing to do with the mild turbulence they encountered over the Midwest plains. Doug, unaware of Ethan's true identity, remained a friendly seatmate. "So what brings a history teacher to Kansas City?" Ethan had prepared for this. "Education conference," he replied smoothly, "presenting a workshop on interactive teaching methods." Doug grinned. "That's great. My kid's school could use more of that." The conversation flowed naturally, and for a moment, Ethan was able to forget the disparities around him. But then Doug casually remarked, "I travel so much I could probably do this flight blindfolded. I don't think I've ever had my boarding pass checked twice, though. Strange how they singled you out." Ethan gave a tight-lipped smile. "Yeah. Strange." Doug didn't press further, but his observation confirmed what Ethan already knew. This wasn't just in his head. As they landed in Kansas City, Ethan thanked Doug for the conversation. "If your daughter ever wants a reading list to make history more interesting, let me know." Doug laughed, handing him a business card. "I might take you up on that. Safe travels, Mr. Clark." Ethan stepped off the plane and into the terminal, already mentally preparing for the next leg of his journey. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to Lena. "First flight done? Some things to note. Subtle, but noticeable." Her reply came back almost instantly. "Keep documenting everything, and stay sharp." Ethan sighed and rolled his shoulders, shaking off the discomfort. 4 more days to go, and something told him the worst was yet to come. Ethan Carter stepped off the plane in Kansas City, still processing everything that had happened during the flight. The business card from Doug Langford rested in his pocket, a small reminder that not every interaction on this journey would be negative. Despite the casual camaraderie he'd shared with Doug, the subtle disparities in service had been impossible to ignore. As Ethan Clark, history teacher from St. Louis, it had taken less than 2 hours to experience the type of treatment he had been shielded from as CEO. Now, with a 2-hour layover before his connection to Memphis, Ethan found a quiet corner of the terminal, pulled out his phone, and began to document everything. The longer wait times for service, the boarding pass check that only applied to him, the difference in tone and warmth from the crew. None of these things were dramatic enough to warrant a formal complaint, but they were the kinds of accumulated microaggressions that made the experience of black travelers feel subtly, but unmistakably, different. Before he could type another note, his phone buzzed. Lena Patel. "First impressions?" Ethan exhaled slowly before responding. "Educational." A moment later, she replied, "Do you want to abort? We can always say you got sick and reschedule." Ethan hesitated. The flights ahead were longer, covering routes with higher complaint rates. If the relatively mild Kansas City flight had already revealed concerning disparities, what awaited him in the places where complaints were the worst? But backing out wasn't an option. "No," he texted. "I need to see this through, especially Birmingham." "Understood. Just document everything. Names, times, behaviors." "Already on it. How are things at the office?" "Jordan's covering the executive meeting this afternoon. Told everyone you're at a private industry summit. No questions so far." Ethan nodded to himself. As long as Jordan and Lena handled things back at Horizon Airways headquarters, he could stay fully immersed in this experience. With his layover nearing its end, Ethan wandered through the terminal, casually observing how Horizon employees interacted with different passengers. At the gate for his Memphis flight, he noticed a black family with young children being questioned extensively about their boarding passes, while white passengers were processed quickly and with smiles. He clenched his jaw. It was another small thing, but it reinforced the growing pattern. The next flight introduced a stark contrast. Ethan had been assigned a bulkhead exit row seat. Shortly after takeoff, a flight attendant approached him. Her name tag read Ava. "First time flying Horizon?" she asked with a warm smile. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That obvious?" She laughed. "You're not buried in your phone, ignoring the safety briefing. That's usually a dead giveaway." Ethan chuckled. "Fair point. Well, if you need anything, just let me know," Ava said before moving down the aisle. Ethan made a note, completely different energy from Ryan on the first flight. Throughout the journey, he observed Ava's consistent professionalism. She maintained the same level of attentiveness to every passenger, regardless of race or status. When turbulence hit, a young white man tried to get up for the restroom. "I'm sorry, sir, but the seatbelt sign is on," Ava said, firm but polite. He protested. "I really need to go." "For your safety, I need you to remain seated," she repeated calmly, not backing down. Ethan watched, comparing her demeanor to Ryan's on his previous flight, where the tone and level of service had varied depending on the passenger. As they landed in Memphis, Ethan stepped off the plane with mixed emotions. The contrast between the two flight crews made him wonder, was Ryan an anomaly, or was Ava the exception? Was the bias systemic or dependent on individual crew members? How many passengers were silent about their experiences, simply learning to expect less? Exhausted from a long day of travel, Ethan checked into a downtown Memphis hotel. He ordered room service, choosing not to risk running into Horizon employees who might recognize him. As he ate, he composed a detailed email to Lena, outlining everything he had seen so far. Tomorrow would bring 2 more flights, Memphis to Chicago, then Chicago to Minneapolis. He suspected things would only get more revealing. The next morning, Ethan boarded his flight to Chicago, mentally preparing for the day ahead. Seated beside him was a young black woman in her mid-20s. She introduced herself as Maya, a first-year law student at Vanderbilt. As they chatted, she confided in him. "Flying is always stressful for me. Not just the usual travel anxiety, but the extra layer that comes with it." Ethan tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "It's wondering if I'll be randomly selected for extra screening, or if the person next to me will ask to switch seats, or if the flight attendants will pretend I don't exist." Her words hit Ethan harder than he expected. "Have you had that happen before?" She shrugged. "It happens everywhere. Some airlines are better than others, but you always feel it. The need to be extra polite, extra accommodating, extra non-threatening." Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing her words. As CEO, he had spent years focusing on the blatant, explicit incidents, the kind that got reported, the kind that could be quantified and addressed through policies. But he had failed to fully grasp the impact of these smaller, more insidious experiences. The cumulative weight of subtle biases of being overlooked or singled out was just as damaging. In Minneapolis, Ethan had an unexpected encounter. While waiting for his connection to Denver, he spotted Andrew Coleman, Horizon Airways Vice President of Customer Experience, walking through the terminal. Ethan's heart pounded. If anyone would recognize him despite the disguise, it was Andrew. He had been instrumental in designing the very service standards that were now being questioned. Ethan quickly moved behind a pillar, watching as Andrew passed by, without noticing him. It was a close call, a reminder of the risks he was taking, but it also strengthened his resolve. The only way to fix the problem was to see it firsthand. The flight from Minneapolis to Denver introduced yet another type of flight crew. This team, led by Meredith, operated with strict efficiency but little warmth. They weren't overtly discriminatory. In fact, they seemed equally brusque with all passengers. But there was a noticeable lack of patience when dealing with non-English speakers, elderly passengers, anyone needing extra assistance. Ethan watched as an elderly Latino couple struggled to understand the safety demonstration. The flight attendant's irritation was barely concealed. Yet, when a white businessman struggled to stow his oversized bag, the same attendant cheerfully assisted him. By Wednesday night, Ethan had completed 5 flights and was beginning to see clear, undeniable patterns. Discrimination wasn't universal, but where it existed, it followed a predictable script. Slower response times to black passengers, less proactive assistance, frequent questioning of seat assignments and boarding passes. The bias wasn't always overt, but it was there. As he lay in bed that night, Ethan stared at the ceiling, realizing something chilling. The company he had built from the ground up was failing the very people he had vowed to serve, and he had never even noticed. Sitting on the edge of his Denver hotel bed, Ethan Carter stared at the notes on his phone, his frustration mounting. He pressed the video call button for Lena Patel and Jordan Fields, lowering his voice despite being alone in the room. "The data is clear," Ethan said, scrolling through his detailed notes. "This isn't just bad customer service. There's a pattern of differential treatment that can't be dismissed as coincidence." Jordan frowned. "We've spent millions on diversity training, on inclusive hiring, on reworking our policies. How is this happening under our noses?" Ethan let out a slow sigh, running a hand over his now bare chin, a reminder of the disguise that had allowed him to experience this treatment firsthand. "Because we've been looking at the wrong metrics." Lena leaned forward. "Explain." "We've been tracking formal complaints, explicit incidents, things that are easy to quantify. But what I'm experiencing? It's more subtle. It's in the tone of voice, the extra second of hesitation before assisting a black passenger, the assumption that I might be in the wrong seat." Lena's expression hardened. "So what do we do? More training?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't know yet. Let me finish the week. I still have Denver to Los Angeles tomorrow, then the overnight to New York, and finally the Birmingham flight on Friday. I need the full picture before we decide on a course of action." After ending the call, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The reality weighed on him. The company he had built, the airline that was supposed to reflect his father's values of dignity and respect, was failing its passengers of color, and he hadn't seen it. Until now. The next morning, Ethan took his seat in the bulkhead row on his flight to Los Angeles. Beside him, a chatty white woman in her 60s adjusted her travel pillow and smiled warmly. "I'm Barbara," she introduced herself. "Visiting my grandkids in California. And you?" Ethan gave his rehearsed cover story. "Ethan Clark, history teacher, just heading out for a conference." Within minutes of takeoff, Barbara was deep into conversation. "I miss teaching, but not all the new politics. Everything is so complicated now with diversity training and whatnot." Ethan remained neutral, nodding slightly. "How so?" "Well, take this airline, for instance." She lowered her voice slightly, as if sharing a secret. "I read an article about how they're really pushing this diversity thing. Even their CEO is black." Ethan kept his expression carefully unreadable. "Is that so?" Barbara nodded. "Yes, I saw him in an interview. Very articulate." Ethan had to resist the urge to laugh bitterly. He had heard this kind of comment before, meant as a compliment, but laced with an underlying assumption. Barbara continued, "But between you and me, I think all this focus on diversity can actually make things worse. People start walking on eggshells, afraid to say the wrong thing." Ethan studied her carefully. "So you don't think companies should prioritize treating all customers equally?" Barbara hesitated, shifting in her seat. "Well, of course they should. I just mean, sometimes it feels like certain groups get special treatment, and that's not equality either, is it?" Before Ethan could respond, the beverage cart rolled up, manned by a middle-aged flight attendant named Robert. With Barbara, Robert was friendly, warm, even joking about the turbulence. When he turned to Ethan, his demeanor shifted, still professional, but noticeably cooler, more detached. "And for you, sir?" Robert asked, his smile fading slightly. "Coffee? Black." As Robert moved on, Barbara leaned closer to Ethan, lowering her voice again. "See? Perfectly nice to both of us. No discrimination there." Ethan bit back a response. She hadn't noticed the difference. The warmth that was present for her, but absent for him. And that was the real problem. People who weren't affected by discrimination often didn't see it at all. The red-eye flight to New York was quieter than the others. Minimal service. Lights out. A quick continental breakfast before landing. But even in this reduced service environment, the pattern remained. When Ethan requested an extra blanket, he was told none were available. 20 minutes later, he watched as the same flight attendant handed blankets to white and Asian passengers. When breakfast was served, his entire row was nearly forgotten. The flight attendant had to double back after passing them by. When a white businessman complained about the cabin temperature, the response was immediate and apologetic. When Ethan had made the same observation earlier, he had received a brief, dismissive, "We'll see what we can do." By the time the plane touched down in New York, Ethan was exhausted and disheartened. 9 flights, 6 airlines. A consistent pattern of subtle but unmistakable bias, not from every crew member, not on every flight, but frequently enough that it couldn't be dismissed as isolated incidents. Stepping into his hotel room in Manhattan, Ethan dropped his bag and turned on the shower. Tomorrow was the final test. The flight to Birmingham, the one that had generated the most troubling complaints. Ethan had a bad feeling about what he was about to witness, and for the first time since he started this journey, he wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next. Ethan Carter stood in front of the bathroom mirror of his New York hotel room, staring at the unfamiliar version of himself. The absence of his beard still felt strange, as if he were looking at someone else entirely. Today was the final and most critical leg of his journey. Flight 2268 to Birmingham, the route with the most troubling reports of discriminatory treatment. Whatever he discovered today would determine the course of action for Horizon Airways moving forward. His phone buzzed. Jordan Fields. "How are you holding up?" his friend asked, concern evident in his voice. Ethan sighed. "Tired, frustrated, but determined. Lena told me you've been sending detailed reports after every flight. It sounds pretty bad." Ethan rubbed his forehead. "It's not universally bad. Some crew members are excellent, professional, fair, treating every passenger with respect. But there's a pattern, Jordan, a clear pattern of differential treatment. There was a long pause before Jordan spoke again. Are you sure you're not just seeing what you want to see? I mean, you're looking for bias. Could it be making things seem worse? Ethan had expected this question. He had asked himself the same thing multiple times throughout the week. That's why I've been meticulous. I'm not going off feelings. I've documented specific behaviors, response times, eye contact, tone of voice, quality of service. The data doesn't lie, Jordan. Another silence. So what are you going to do when you get back? Ethan exhaled slowly. I'm still working that out. But it's not going to be another training program or policy update. That's not enough. We need to address the culture itself. That's not going to be easy. No, it won't. But it has to be done. Ending the call, Ethan grabbed his bag and headed to the airport, a mix of dread and anticipation swirling in his chest. At the gate, Ethan's stomach tightened. A familiar figure stood near the boarding area. Ryan, the same flight attendant who had treated him coldly on his first flight from Kansas City. Of all the crew members, it had to be him. Ethan's mind raced. Would Ryan recognize him? His disguise had worked so far, but if anyone was going to blow his cover, it would be someone he had already encountered. Keeping his head down, Ethan boarded quietly when his zone was called, making his way to row 14, a middle seat. To his left sat an elderly black woman, her posture upright and dignified despite her frail frame. Dorothy, she introduced herself. Retired school principal, heading to Birmingham to see my grandbabies. To his right was a young white woman, fully absorbed in her laptop, barely acknowledging either of them. The flight was full, and the crew seemed rushed even before takeoff. That's when Ethan noticed the first red flag. Ryan, moving efficiently through the aisle, stopped at row 14. He helped the white woman with her carry-on but didn't offer the same courtesy to Dorothy, who was struggling to lift her heavy bag into the overhead compartment. Ethan waited for Ryan to assist. He didn't. Excuse me, Ethan said, his voice firm but calm. Can you help her with that? Ryan glanced at Ethan, then at Dorothy, his expression flickering with something unreadable. Of course, he said, but his tone made it clear he wouldn't have done it if Ethan hadn't spoken up. Ethan noted the interaction in his phone. Lack of proactive assistance for black passengers. The flight had barely begun, and he could already see where this was going. As the flight progressed, Ethan observed Ryan and another flight attendant, Patricia, a middle-aged woman with short blonde hair. They consistently prioritized white passengers, while giving minimal attention to others. When the beverage cart came through, Patricia served the white woman next to Ethan first, despite Dorothy having her tray table down and waiting. When Dorothy asked for ginger ale for her stomach, Patricia curtly responded that they were out, only for Ethan to see Ryan serve the same drink to a white passenger 2 rows back just minutes later. A white passenger pressed the call button. Ryan responded instantly. A black passenger 2 rows behind pressed their call button. It was ignored until the third attempt. The tipping point came when turbulence hit. A black mother across the aisle struggled to secure her infant in the unexpected jolt. Ethan watched as Patricia hesitated, taking noticeable seconds longer than she had when assisting a white family earlier in the flight. By the time Patricia finally moved to help, the mother had already managed on her own. Dorothy let out a quiet sigh beside Ethan. You know, she said softly, I've been flying since the 1960s. Things have changed a lot. Ethan turned to her. But some things stay the same. He finished for her. Dorothy nodded. I've learned not to expect much attention. That way, I'm never disappointed. Her words hit Ethan harder than anything else on this trip. Because this quiet acceptance of being overlooked, ignored, treated as an afterthought, was exactly what he feared most. Passengers like Dorothy weren't filing formal complaints. They weren't demanding better service. They had simply lowered their expectations. And that was the real problem. As the plane began its descent into Birmingham, Ethan sat in silence, staring out the window. This wasn't just a few bad apples. This was systemic, not because every employee was biased, but because enough of them were, and those who weren't challenging the ones who were. It wasn't just about the blatant incidents. It was about the small moments that stacked up over time, shaping a completely different experience for passengers of color. And his airline was part of the problem. For the first time since he started Horizon Airways, Ethan felt something he never had before. Shame. As the plane touched down, Ethan knew one thing for certain. His work at Horizon was just beginning. Because this had to change, immediately. As Ethan Carter helped Dorothy down the jetway, his mind raced. He had just witnessed the final straw, not a subtle slight or passive oversight, but an outright dismissal of a passenger in need. Dorothy had struggled to retrieve her bag from the overhead bin, her cane wobbling as she reached up. Other passengers brushed past her, the flight attendants too busy to notice. Ethan had stepped forward to help, only for Ryan to appear beside him. "I've got it, sir," Ryan said, his tone coldly professional. Then in a lower voice, just for Ethan, "Maybe next time you should stick to your assigned seat area instead of wandering around the cabin." Ethan froze. It wasn't just rudeness. It wasn't just indifference. Ryan had assumed he was being intrusive, not helpful. The implication was clear, and it left Ethan momentarily speechless. Dorothy, ever the teacher, patted his arm gently. "Don't let it bother you, young man. Some people just can't see past their own assumptions." Ethan nodded, though inside he was seething. This wasn't some abstract problem happening at another company. This was his airline, built on his father's dream, and it was failing the very passengers it had promised to serve with dignity and respect. In his Birmingham hotel room that night, Ethan paced, staring out at the city lights. He had seen enough. Tomorrow's flights? Cancelled. It was time to go back and fix what was broken. He picked up his phone and called Lena. Despite the late hour, she answered immediately. "I'm coming back tomorrow," he told her, "and I need you to arrange something." "What do you need?" "A meeting with the entire crew from today's flight. No explanations, just tell them it's a focus group on customer experience." Lena hesitated. "Do you want to reveal yourself?" Ethan thought about it. "Not yet. I want to address this as the CEO, not as the passenger they discriminated against." "Understood. I'll set it up." Hanging up, Ethan exhaled deeply. This was going to be messy. But change always was. The next morning, Ethan boarded his return flight to Dallas, this time in first class. A small concession to his frayed nerves. As the plane climbed into the sky, he reviewed his notes from the past 5 days. 15 flights. 23 distinct incidents of differential treatment. 8 crew members exhibiting clear bias. Not everyone. In fact, the majority of Horizon employees he'd encountered had been professional and fair. But the problem was real, and it was big enough that it needed to be addressed immediately. Ethan went straight from the airport to Horizon Airways headquarters. The moment he stepped into his penthouse apartment, the transformation began. The beard would take weeks to grow back, but the suit, the glasses, and most importantly, the authority, returned immediately. At 1:55 p.m., Ethan stood outside Conference Room B composing himself. Inside were Ryan, Patricia, and the other crew members from Flight 2268. None of them had any idea what was coming. At 2 sharp, he walked in. The room fell silent. Crew members straightened in their seats, the relaxed atmosphere evaporating. They recognized immediately that this was not the focus group they had expected. Ethan took his place at the head of the table. "Good afternoon." His voice was steady. "For those of you who don't know me personally, I'm Ethan Carter, CEO and founder of Horizon Airways." The reaction was instant, eyes widening, back stiffening. Some looked shocked, others nervous. Ryan's jaw tightened. Patricia blinked rapidly, glancing at her colleagues. Ethan let the weight of his presence settle over them. "I've asked you here today because I want to talk about Flight 2068 from New York to Birmingham yesterday. Specifically, I want to talk about the treatment of passengers on that flight." Ryan shifted uncomfortably. Patricia's brows knit together in confusion. Ethan continued. "For the past week, I have been traveling on Horizon Airways flights as a regular passenger. No beard, no title, no privileges." He paused, making direct eye contact with each of them. "I wanted to experience our airline the way our customers do, and what I experienced was deeply troubling." A heavy silence filled the room. Ethan pulled out his tablet and began to go through his observations, methodically, factually. He never raised his voice, never made accusations. He simply stated the facts: the preferential treatment given to white passengers, the dismissal of black passengers' concerns, the consistent pattern of small but undeniable biases. With each example, the room grew tenser. Some crew members looked genuinely shocked. A few, especially a younger flight attendant named Noah, appeared distressed by what they were hearing. Ethan set down his tablet. I want to be very clear. What I observed isn't just bad customer service, it's discrimination, and it's happening on my airline, under my watch. A chill passed through the room. Ryan finally spoke. His voice was tight. Mr. Carter, with all due respect, I treat all passengers equally. If there were differences in service, it was due to operational constraints, not. Ethan cut him off gently. Ryan, I was in row 14 yesterday. Ryan's mouth clamped shut. I watched you ignore an elderly black woman struggling with her bag while helping a white passenger across the aisle. I heard what you said to me when I tried to help her deplane. A horrible realization dawned in Ryan's eyes. Ethan folded his hands. I'm not here to fire people. I'm here to fix a culture. If you're willing to be part of that change, you have a place at Horizon. If you're not, then you don't. A long silence stretched between them. Then, in a quiet voice, Ryan spoke. I didn't realize. Ethan studied him. That's the problem. Ryan swallowed hard. Patricia looked down at the table. The room sat in heavy silence, the weight of the conversation settling over everyone. Ethan straightened. Change starts today, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something unexpected. Hope, because this was only the beginning. Ethan Carter sat at the head of the conference table, his expression unreadable. Ryan's words still hung in the air. Mr. Carter, with all due respect, I treat all passengers equally. If there were any differences in service, it was due to operational constraints or... Ethan cut him off gently. Ryan, I was in row 14 yesterday. Ryan's face drained of color. I watched you ignore an elderly black woman struggling with her bag while assisting the white passenger across the aisle. I heard what you said to me when I tried to help her deplane. The realization dawned on Ryan like a slow-moving storm. The man he had dismissed, subtly mistreated, and spoken down to had been his CEO. A heavy silence filled the room. Ethan let it settle before continuing. I'm not here to fire anyone. Several crew members visibly exhaled, but their relief was short-lived. I'm here because we have a serious problem, and we need to fix it, together. He let his gaze move across the room. Horizon Airways was built on a promise of dignity and respect for every person who steps onto our planes. Somewhere along the way, we failed to live up to that promise. Patricia, the senior flight attendant, hesitantly raised her hand. Mr. Carter, I don't think any of us realized we were doing what you're describing. It wasn't intentional. Ethan nodded, his voice calm but firm. I believe you. Most bias isn't conscious. It's in the assumptions we make, the reflexive reactions we have. But intention doesn't change impact. And the impact on our passengers, on me, when I was just another black man in row 14, is real. A younger flight attendant, Noah, spoke up. So, what happens now, sir? It was the question Ethan had been grappling with since Birmingham, but he finally had an answer. Now, we do the hard work of change. Ethan laid out the plan he and Lena had drafted that morning. 1. Mystery passenger assessments. A new system where anonymous evaluators would fly Horizon routes, specifically monitoring for patterns of biased treatment. 2. A direct passenger feedback system, an updated reporting platform where passengers could flag concerns about service disparities in real time. 3. Mentorship and cross-training. Crew members from different backgrounds would be paired together to foster greater understanding and accountability. 4. CEO visibility. Ethan himself would fly regularly, not undercover, but openly, on Horizon flights. I want to lead by example, Ethan said, to show that serving every passenger with dignity isn't just company policy, it's our fundamental purpose. The meeting stretched on for nearly 2 hours, evolving from a tense presentation into a candid discussion. Some crew members remained defensive, others were quietly reflective, and a few, like Noah, seemed genuinely moved by the conversation. By the time the room emptied, Ethan knew this was just the beginning. As the last crew member left, Ethan called Ryan back. The two men sat across from each other, an unspoken tension between them. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. I want to apologize, he finally said, voice subdued. I'd like to say I didn't realize what I was doing, but looking back, I can see it, and I'm ashamed. Ethan studied him, seeing not an antagonist but a man confronting his own blind spots. I appreciate that, Ryan. but I'm more interested in what happens next than in what happened yesterday. Ryan swallowed hard. What has happened next? For me, I mean. Ethan leaned forward. That depends on you. I meant what I said. I'm not here to fire people. I'm here to fix a culture. If you're willing to be part of that solution, to really examine your behaviors and commit to change, then there's a place for you at Horizon. Ryan hesitated, then finally nodded. I want that chance, sir, I really do. As Ryan left the conference room, Lena walked in, her expression questioning. How did it go? Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. Better than I expected, actually. Defensive? Some were, but there was also some real reflection. Ryan in particular had a moment of clarity. Lena crossed her arms. And now? Ethan didn't hesitate. This is just one crew from one flight. The problem is clearly bigger. So we roll this out company-wide, not as a punishment, but as a call to action. Lena exhaled. There's going to be resistance. Ethan nodded. Of course, change is hard, especially when it forces people to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. But we don't have a choice. If Horizon is going to live up to its founding promise, we need to do this work. Over the next several days, Ethan led a series of meetings with department heads, union representatives, key team leaders. In each session, he presented his findings, laying out the problems and solutions with unflinching honesty. Some executives understood immediately and pledged their full support. Others were defensive, questioning the validity of his observations, whether he had been looking for problems and therefore finding them. If the airline could afford to shift resources to address what some saw as subjective issues. Through it all, Ethan remained steadfast. This isn't about perceptions, he told his executive team during one heated discussion. It's about behaviors. Measurable, observable behaviors that are creating different experiences for different passengers, based solely on race. Finally, Jordan, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, spoke. I've been reviewing the data Ethan collected during his Undercover week, he said. As a numbers guy, I was skeptical at first, but the patterns are undeniable. Response times, eye contact, proactive service. In every measurable category, black passengers were treated differently. His voice carried weight. Jordan had always been the data-driven, pragmatic leader of Horizon. His endorsement shifted the tone of the meeting. By the end of the week, Ethan had secured enough buy-in to begin rolling out the new initiatives. The resistance wasn't gone, but it had been pushed aside just enough for progress to begin. That night, as Ethan sat in his office, he found himself thinking about Dorothy. She had accepted being ignored because she had learned not to expect more. I've learned not to expect much attention. That way, I'm never disappointed. That was what Ethan was fighting to change. He picked up his phone. Lena, can we track down a passenger from Flight 2268? A retired school principal named Dorothy? Lena sounded surprised. I'll see what I can do. Why? Ethan smiled slightly. Because she's the reason we're doing this. As the new policies rolled out across Horizon Airways, Ethan knew there would be challenges ahead. But for the first time, he also knew they were headed in the right direction. Ethan Carter sat at the head of the executive boardroom, surrounded by department heads, senior executives, and key decision-makers. The meeting had been tense from the start. These are subjective perceptions, not objective data, one executive argued. We can't afford to overhaul our entire training model based on feelings, another added. Through it all, Ethan remained steadfast. This isn't about perceptions, he said, his voice calm but firm. It's about behaviors. Measurable, observable behaviors that are creating different experiences for different passengers, based solely on their race. The room fell silent. Then Jordan Fields, Horizon's CFO, spoke up. He had been quiet throughout the meeting, analyzing the reports, reviewing the numbers. I've been going through the data Ethan collected during his Undercover week, Jordan said, adjusting his glasses. As a numbers guy, I was skeptical at first, but the patterns are undeniable. All eyes turned toward him. Response times to call buttons, duration of eye contact during interactions, proactive service offerings. In every measurable category, black passengers were treated differently. His support shifted the entire tone of the meeting. If even the most data-driven executive in the room was convinced, there was no denying the problem anymore. By the end of the week, Ethan had secured buy-in from most key stakeholders. The resistance hadn't disappeared, but it had been pushed to the margins, allowing implementation of the Equitable Service Initiative to begin in earnest. The new program went far beyond traditional diversity training. It was designed to directly address the patterns of behavior Ethan had observed firsthand. It included regular mystery passenger assessments. Anonymous evaluators would fly Horizon routes to track real-time service disparities. Mentorship and cross-training. Crew members from different backgrounds would be paired together to foster understanding and accountability. Revised performance evaluations. Employee reviews would now include equity metrics, ensuring that bias in service was addressed. Passenger feedback system. A new reporting tool would allow passengers to flag concerns immediately, capturing issues that traditional complaint systems had missed. CEO visibility. Ethan and other executives committed to flying regularly on Horizon flights. Not undercover, but openly. "I want to lead by example," Ethan told his leadership team. "We don't just talk about dignity, we demonstrate it." As the program took shape, Ethan found himself thinking often about Dorothy, the retired principal from his Birmingham flight. Her quiet resignation had stayed with him. "I've learned not to expect much attention. That way I'm never disappointed." She had accepted being overlooked as just a fact of life, and that was exactly what Ethan was trying to change. On impulse, he asked his assistant to track her down. It was a long shot, but she had mentioned being a retired school principal. To his surprise, they found her within a day. Dorothy Wells, former principal of Oakwood High School in Birmingham, now a community activist working with at-risk youth. Ethan called her personally. "Mrs. Wells, this is Ethan Carter." There was a pause, then a warm chuckle. "Ah, the young man who helped me with my bag, though you look quite different in the photos I've seen of you, Mr. Carter." Ethan laughed. "The beard makes a difference, Mrs. Wells." "It certainly does. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I wanted to thank you. Our conversation on that flight pushed me to make some major changes at Horizon." "Is that so? Well, I'm glad to hear it, though I'm not sure what I did except complain a bit about the service." Ethan shook his head. "It wasn't what you said, it was how you said it, the resignation in your voice. You made me realize how many passengers must feel that way, how many have just accepted being treated as second-class travelers." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "That's a heavy burden to place on an old woman's offhand comment, Mr. Carter." "Perhaps, but sometimes it's the small moments that affect us most deeply." He took a breath. "I'd like to invite you to join our customer advisory board as we implement these changes. Your perspective would be invaluable." Dorothy let out a soft laugh. "Well now, that's not an offer I was expecting. Let me think about it, Mr. Carter." She thought for only a few seconds. "All right, I'm in." In the weeks that followed, the changes at Horizon Airways began to take shape. New training programs were rolled out. The passenger feedback system was activated. A company-wide conversation about equity and dignity took root. Not everyone embraced the changes. Some employees quit, unwilling to participate in what they saw as unnecessary policies. Others complied outwardly but privately resisted the message. But many, including Ryan and Patricia, engaged deeply in the process. They confronted their biases. They worked to change. 3 months after his undercover journey, Ethan found himself back on Flight 2268, this time openly as CEO, and seated right beside him, Dorothy Wells. As they boarded, she raised an eyebrow at him. "Let's see if this experience is any different." It didn't take long to notice the change. When Dorothy struggled to stow her bag, a flight attendant immediately stepped forward to help. Ethan smiled, recognizing him. It was Ryan. His demeanor was different now, his tone warmer, more intentional. "Let me get that for you, ma'am." Dorothy settled into her seat. "My goodness," she murmured, shaking her head. "What a difference." Ethan watched the crew carefully throughout the flight. The service was fair, equitable. No delayed responses, no subtle dismissals, no differences in treatment based on race. They had a long way to go, but they were on the right path. "You've certainly shaken things up, young man," Dorothy remarked. Ethan smiled. "That was the plan, Mrs. Wells." As the plane soared through the sky, he reflected on how far Horizon had come, and how far it still had to go. For the first time in months, he felt hopeful, because now he knew the journey to change had only just begun. Change takes time. As the plane lifted into the sky, Ethan Carter reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The painful revelations, the difficult conversations, the ongoing work of transformation. It had all begun with a simple question. What was really happening on his airline? The answer had been harder to face than he had expected, but it had also been necessary. Back home, in his late father's old office, there was a small plaque on the wall. Words that had guided Ethan through every major decision of his life. You cannot change what you refuse to see. And now, by choosing to see, really see, the reality of his own company, Ethan had taken the first crucial step toward meaningful change. The flight to Birmingham proceeded smoothly, a testament to the progress being made at Horizon Airways. But Ethan knew this was just the beginning. The work of building a truly equitable airline, one where every passenger was treated with dignity and respect, would be ongoing. As they began their descent, Dorothy Wells reached over and patted his hand. "You know," she said, her voice warm but firm, "most people in your position wouldn't have bothered. They would have delegated the problem, or denied it existed at all." Ethan thought of the comfortable corner office he had left behind. The insulation of privilege that had kept him from seeing the reality his passengers faced every day. "Sometimes," he told her, "the only way to truly understand a problem is to experience it yourself." As the plane touched down, Ethan gazed out at the Birmingham skyline, thinking of his father and the dreams that had inspired Horizon Airways. For the first time in months, he felt certain. They were flying in the right direction again. 6 months after Ethan's undercover journey, the story leaked to the press. A junior HR staff member, inspired by the changes being implemented, shared the tale with a friend who worked at a major business magazine. The resulting feature, "The CEO Who Flew Coach: How Ethan Carter Transformed Horizon Airways from the Inside Out." The story catapulted both Ethan and the airline into the national spotlight. The public response was overwhelming. Letters and emails poured in from passengers who shared their own experiences and thanked Ethan for taking their concerns seriously. Industry analysts, initially skeptical, began noting Horizon's improved customer satisfaction scores across all demographic groups. Other airlines, facing similar issues but less willing to confront them directly, watched with a mix of admiration and trepidation. Ethan used the increased attention to further advance his vision. He spoke candidly in interviews about what he had discovered and the changes that had resulted. He challenged other CEOs to step out of their corner offices and experience their own companies as ordinary customers. And most importantly, he continued to fly regularly on Horizon routes, sometimes in first class, sometimes in coach, always observing, always interacting with passengers and crew. 1 year after his undercover journey, Ethan found himself seated on a flight to Chicago. Next to him sat a young black man, visibly nervous. Ethan smiled. "First flight?" The young man nodded. "That obvious, huh?" "A little. I've got a job interview in Chicago, first time I've ever left Tennessee." Ethan's smile widened. "You're in good hands. Horizon has some of the best crew in the business." As if on cue, a flight attendant appeared in the aisle beside them. Ethan looked up and felt a jolt of recognition. It was Ryan. Their eyes met. There was a brief, unspoken moment between them, a quiet acknowledgement of how far they had both come. "Can I get either of you gentlemen anything before takeoff?" Ryan asked, his manner warm and professional. The young man hesitated. Just some water, please." Instead of the rushed, indifferent response that Ryan might have once given, he took a moment to reassure the nervous passenger. "First flights can feel a little overwhelming," Ryan said, kneeling slightly to be at eye level. "But you'll be just fine. Takeoff is the bumpiest part, but once we're in the air, it's smooth sailing. I'll check on you once we hit cruising altitude, all right?" The young man visibly relaxed. Ethan watched as Ryan moved on, interacting with every passenger with the same level of attentiveness and care. "See?" Ethan said, smiling. "Good hands." The young man had no idea about the journey that had led to this moment, the uncomfortable revelations, the difficult conversations, the ongoing work of building a culture where this kind of service was the norm, not the exception. As the plane lifted into the clouds, Ethan thought about the road ahead. Horizon Airways wasn't perfect. No organization ever could be. Biases ran deep. and the work of countering them was never truly complete. But they were committed to the journey, to seeing clearly, to doing better each day. And as long as they kept moving forward, Ethan knew they would never lose their way again. Ethan Carter sat by the window, watching as the patchwork of America unfolded beneath the aircraft's wings. He flipped open the same notebook he had used during his undercover journey. Back then, its pages had been filled with frustration. Documented slights, differential treatment, the uncomfortable truths he couldn't ignore. Today, his notes told a different story. A flight attendant checking on an elderly black woman with the same warmth and attentiveness as every other passenger. A nervous first-time traveler being reassured rather than dismissed. Crew members treating every person on board with the same level of dignity and care. This was real progress, not perfection, but a culture slowly shifting toward fairness. Beside him, the young man he had spoken with earlier had dozed off, his initial anxiety about flying replaced by exhaustion and trust. Ethan smiled, feeling the gentle rhythm of the plane carrying them forward. There would be more challenges ahead, more blind spots to recognize, more work to be done. But one thing was certain. The decision to step out of his corner office and into that middle seat in row 14 had been one of the most important choices of his career. Sometimes, the most valuable perspective comes when you surrender your privileges and see the world through different eyes. For Ethan Carter and Horizon Airways, that perspective had been transformative. The transformation of Horizon Airways didn't end with rising customer satisfaction scores or positive press coverage. The real measure of success came in the countless small interactions happening every day across their network. Interactions that most passengers never noticed, precisely because they were now so consistently positive. The mentorship program, which had originally been a small initiative, had expanded into a cornerstone of Horizon's corporate culture. Crew members like Ryan, who had once exhibited biased behavior, became some of the strongest advocates for equitable service, often sharing their own journeys of recognition and change with new hires. 1 year after the Business Magazine article was published, Horizon Airways hosted an industry-wide conference on equitable customer service. Executives from airlines across the country attended, eager to learn from Horizon's success. Ethan took the stage for the keynote address. The problem with most corporate diversity efforts, he told the room, is that they focus on metrics rather than experiences. They track hiring numbers, count complaints, measure representation in leadership. All of those things matter, but they don't capture the lived reality of passengers or employees. He introduced a concept he called the dignity gap. The difference between how companies perceive themselves and how they are experienced by those without power or privilege. Closing that gap requires more than policies or training programs, he argued. It requires a fundamental commitment to seeing through others' eyes, to valuing every person's experience as legitimate and worthy of response. The conference marked a turning point, not just for Horizon Airways, but for the industry as a whole. Other airlines, once reluctant to address these issues, began implementing similar initiatives. Because in an increasingly diverse marketplace, equitable service wasn't just a moral imperative, it was a business necessity. For Ethan, the lessons from his undercover journey continued to shape his leadership. The week he had spent as just another black traveler had stripped away layers of privilege and protection, reconnecting him with experiences he had been insulated from for years. That reconnection informed every decision he made, from road expansions to hiring practices to investor relations. When Horizon introduced a new route connecting Dallas to Montgomery, Alabama, a city rich in civil rights history but underserved by major carriers, Ethan insisted on taking the inaugural flight, not as CEO, not in first class, but in coach, as a regular passenger. He found himself seated next to an elderly black man who glanced over and gave him a knowing nod. "Not much legroom back here, huh?" the man joked. Ethan chuckled. "No, sir, but at least the company's good." They got to talking, and Ethan quickly realized this man had lived through a very different era of travel. "There was a time," the man said, shaking his head, "when folks who looked like us wouldn't have dared fly at all. The humiliations were too many, the barriers too high." Ethan nodded, thinking of Dorothy, her quiet resignation when she had spoken about learning not to expect attention. "We've come a long way," Ethan acknowledged, "but not far enough." The man studied him for a moment, then nodded. "True enough. But it matters that companies like this one are trying. It matters more than most folks realize." As the plane began its descent into Montgomery, the man added, "My grandson works for an airline, you know, not this one, another one. Tells me things are changing, slowly but surely. Says there's some CEO who went undercover to see how his black passengers were being treated. Made quite a stir in the industry, apparently." Ethan smiled. "Is that so?" "Yes, indeed." The man looked out the window. "We need more leaders like that, folks willing to see the world through someone else's eyes, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable." Ethan sat back in his seat, letting the words sink in. His undercover journey had started as a simple mission to investigate service complaints on his airline. But it had become something bigger, a lesson in leadership, a wake-up call about privilege, a blueprint for change, not just at Horizon Airways, but across an entire industry. The plane touched down, and as Ethan Carter stepped off Flight 682, he knew the journey wasn't over. The work of building a truly equitable airline, one where every passenger was treated with the same dignity and respect, would never be complete. But as long as he kept choosing to see, as long as he kept listening, as long as he kept pushing forward, they would never lose their way again. The phrase, "pulling a Carter," entered the business lexicon, a term for any executive who chose to experience their company from the customer's perspective. But for Ethan Carter, the most meaningful impact wasn't found in headlines or industry recognition. It was in the lives that had been touched and changed. Ryan, the flight attendant, whose biased behavior had been so painfully evident during Ethan's undercover journey, had become Horizon Airways' Director of Equity and Inclusion Training. Standing before new hires during orientation, he often shared his own story. "I didn't see myself as biased," he admitted. "I thought I was treating everyone professionally. It took seeing my own behavior through my CEO's eyes to recognize the subtle ways I was failing to provide truly equitable service." Ryan's story became a powerful teaching tool, helping thousands of employees examine their own blind spots and commit to doing better. Dorothy Wells, the retired principal who had so deeply affected Ethan on that Birmingham flight, became a regular consultant for Horizon's training programs. She helped develop modules that addressed the unique experiences of older passengers of color. During one of her first sessions, she told a room full of airline employees, "The most powerful tool we have for creating change is storytelling. When we hear someone else's experience, really hear it without defensiveness or denial, we open ourselves to growth." Her words resonated beyond the airline, inspiring similar customer experience programs across the hospitality and travel industries. As Ethan sat aboard a flight to Chicago, he looked around the cabin. Beside him sat a young man, nervous but determined, headed to his first job interview in a new city. "You'll do great," Ethan assured him. Somewhere up front, Ryan moved through the aisles, treating every passenger with the same respect and attentiveness. In the training rooms at Horizon, Dorothy continued to shape the next generation of airline professionals. And across the industry, executives had started their own undercover journeys, choosing to see the reality of their businesses through their customers' eyes. The promise of Horizon Airways, dignity and respect for every passenger, seemed not just possible, but within reach. And as the plane banked gently through the sky, carrying a young man toward his future and a CEO mindful of his past, Ethan Carter felt something he hadn't expected to find on this journey. Hope, not the easy optimism of ignorance, but the hard-won hope that comes from facing difficult truths and choosing to do better. Because the work of change, like the work of flight itself, was ongoing. A constant process of navigation, adjustment, and forward momentum toward a distant but worthy destination. And as long as they kept choosing to see, as long as they kept moving forward, they would never lose their way again.